I will say on this particular chapter, which is being connected versus alone, and I know the grammar is always a little confusing for people, but this idea of connection versus being solo in the work that we do is really important. You know, yesterday we spent time talking about how we navigate and build strategies to navigate versus replicate. So we become better at being able to work our way through new terrain and then act in it. This becomes a really key portion of it. It's not just about the fact that we learn to use our compass, but that we're also sharing it and we're getting information from others and responding in real time with others. And I think it's a factor that we probably really underappreciated and underutilized. So I will just sort of dive into this. Chapter is like 40 pages long. There's like no way I can get through all the concepts that are in it. And it also takes really broad terrain, but it starts with this story about when I was at the Microsoft headquarters many years ago on a panel around the future of work. And I will also just point out that of the 9 speakers they had over the course of 3 days, I was the only woman. And when I pointed out to someone, they were shocked. They had no idea. They had never really looked at it that way, which I thought was sort of fascinating. Now that we zoom to where we are now, we're much more aware of that. But I was on this panel, and one of the other panelists was the head of cloud computing at Microsoft at the time, Bob Kelly. And he went on and on about the digital cloud and how extraordinary the digital cloud was going to be and how it was going to enable all these technologies that we were so wishful for, from autonomous vehicles to smart toothbrushes to whatever it is that we needed to be able to take vast amounts of data and analyze it and in real time coordinate our actions differently. And as he was waxing on so enthusiastically about the implications of the digital cloud, I thought to myself, and then somehow boldly said it in this room of 450 tech analysts, what is the equivalent of the human cloud? Right? What is it that allows us to be able to keep up with this pace of technology? And what is the similar accelerant that we would have if the digital cloud accelerates this ability to take in data and change the way we are doing everything? What is the equivalent on the human side of it? And I didn't really know what that meant. Someone came and asked me about it then and wanted to interview me on it. And I'm like, concept that just came up like 4 seconds ago in my brain, but I have spent more time thinking about it. We heard a little bit from Stephen Kotler a couple of days ago, where he talked about the art of the impossible and the neurology around being able to have peak performance and flow. I take a more social side to it, and I say, how is it that we are able to build community? How are we able to collaborate with each other, and how are we able to care for each other? Like, really, to me, at the end of the day, making sure that society and humans are well tended to in this future becomes a really important part, not just because we want to make sure we survive it, but because actually that is the key to being able to make the most of it, right? To build on the opportunities around it. When we don't do that, it hampers it. And unfortunately, we're walking into this big, radical transformation in a pretty poor form. If you look at all the statistics around loneliness, it is, as one measure of this, we are failing quite dramatically. The numbers continue to go down about how people feel connected to one another. The former Surgeon General of the US, Vivek Murthy, Dr. Murthy, did research or found research that showed that loneliness is more lethal than obesity and smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And it wasn't just that people were living longer and living in their homes alone and hanging with their cats, as we sort of see pictures of, various communities around the world, particularly in Japan. This is actually, young people feel this way, people at work feel this way, and it has very huge implications on our productivity and what it is that we're actually able to produce as a result. It's really pretty stunning when you look at the world. So we're going to break this down, if I can, into connections with each other at work, connections with each other in society, and then connections to ourselves if we get that far into the conversation, because really the book sort of goes across all of those domains. It's not just about how we coordinate more successfully at work. It really is across this. And we have 2 guests that will be joining via just the video excerpts today. I don't think they're live, but they're both experts in these domains as we zoom in and zoom out. So I think the key here is that in this era of efficiency, which we discussed yesterday with John Hagel, we have deprioritized connection. We think it's a waste of time to somehow invest in relationships. We want to get right to the meeting. We want to get right to the event. We want to get right to the experience. We want to make sure that we don't in any way waste time by telling stories with each other or connecting or checking in with each other. We don't necessarily care about other people's personal lives, although this year we've certainly paid a little bit more attention to it. But the lack of that shows up. There's a great stat I found when I was researching the book. Actually, I found it on Tumblr one day. 67% of us, I think, prior to the pandemic ate lunch alone at our desk. And the reason I know that stat is because there was a Tumblr post in which people, or a Tumblr, whatever column, in which people would post the pictures of their sad lunch by themselves for everybody else to see. So the irony of the fact that you're eating alone but wanting to like share that with other people was just sort of so sad. But it just becomes, again, it's not efficient, right, to go and have a long lunch. I started my career at the very sort of tail end of the three, martini lunches in New York advertising. And I remember being this like young upstart person who would go to lunch with these much older sales reps who were so sad that I said I had to rush to get back to work. They wanted to stay and hang. And in some ways they had the better idea, right? We have become so much more time pressed that we don't in any way, again, prioritize that. And here's how it's showing up, right? When you ask people about loneliness, millennials have a very high on it. CEOs score high on it. There was a stat we found somewhere that 40% of CEOs feel lonely in their work, right? Because again, they're having to make huge decisions, having to respond in real time and not having necessarily networks, but then they can collaborate and or don't have time or don't, again, prioritize that as a key part of their work. We are seeing really weird high rates of suicide among professions like dentists and veterinarians, right? For some reason, there's a real crisis going on in a range of professions, but those two in particular seem to be ranking really high. In military, we're seeing it high. We're seeing it kind of spread across. And increasingly, we're going to see really high rates of burnout, anxiety, and then related to that, healthcare issues. I gave a keynote talk recently to a group of folks who are in the self-funded insurance world. These are small and mid-sized businesses that have chosen to take on the insurance burden themselves versus go through an insurance agency. And one of the big fears I had as a futurist for them is to recognize that we're going to have escalating healthcare costs that are related to all of the emotional toil that people are going through, right? These things are not unrelated to one another. And so the fact is we're going to have a whole nother range of epidemics that I'm afraid are going to be at our foot in the not too distant future. So, how do we manage for that? But there's not just the human side of it. There's also the business side. We see productivity decrease. We're talking a lot about productivity stats. We see costs increase in places where we could actually have more efficiency. We think that by becoming more siloed and being more separate, we're driving more productivity or we're driving more efficiency. And the reality is we're not doing so. So the question is, how do we sort of work our way out of that? Google, which loves to study this sort of thing, did a project called Project Aristotle. They researched over the course of 2 or 3 years the most effective teams and tried to understand like what would be, again, drive greater output. And what they found was actually very human. It was around vulnerability and around psychological safety that they found. They sort of broke it into team A and team B. And team A was very efficient, made sure that all the meetings, there was no time wasted. We got right down to business. We made decisions very quickly. We executed. And what we found is that people didn't love being on those teams. The output on the teams wasn't that great. It was like there was no cohesiveness that existed in there. And as a result, if there's no cohesiveness, it's also harder to exchange big ideas. It's hard to challenge somebody on something. There is actually the work itself suffers because we're not actually in conversation in a more meaningful way, in a deeper way with one another. What they found is that team B, which spent time at the beginning of a meeting kind of like chit-chatting with each other, telling stories about what's going on, checking in with each other. Sometimes the work would sort of meander and then it would come back, actually had not only greater output, but certainly greater satisfaction about being on those teams. So what's interesting is becomes like, what are some of the ways that people are doing this in remote world or in a more distributed world, or even just in this world that's so based on efficiency. Brene Brown talks a lot about vulnerability and about being able to show our shadow selves. And you'll hear a little bit of something called a DDO, deliberately developmental organization. I always have to say that one 3 times fast. Out of Harvard, and Robert Keegan, who's done a lot of work around that about how we bring our whole selves and we really invest in that more. But it can actually be much simpler. The simplest thing that we're finding out of Harvard and all these other places is around storytelling. And Harvard did work that showed that if you have an ideation session, if you start with an embarrassing story, then you have 30%, I think, or 25% greater output of ideas. And that makes sense, right? If I tell you about something that happened to me when I was in 6th grade that was sort of excruciating, and you tell me about something over here, and all of a sudden we get to see sort of us in our most vulnerable, then suddenly being able to throw out crazy ideas doesn't seem so scary, right? If you come in cold, it actually seems really unsure if that's a good thing to do or not. But we're seeing that happen again more and more. The same Surgeon General, when he started his office in DC, realized that, again, there just wasn't enough cohesiveness. He's, again, been studying loneliness, was trying to figure out a way to solve for it. And so at their weekly team meetings, they initiated a practice in which they would rotate amongst themselves. They would have 5 minutes and 10 slides to be able to tell their coworkers about themselves. And it became the thing that everyone during the week wanted most to be able to, like, they were looking forward to it the most. And as a result, again, all the business performance things went up. People were able to collaborate more. People, like, again, went outside their lane more. People stayed and worked longer. People had bigger ideas. Like, again, all the things that we want to have happen came through the doorway of something that looks much softer or looks less efficient, and turns out to drive all of those things. So again, being connected is so critically important. There's another one that there's a woman who runs a distributed team around the world. And she put on LinkedIn at the beginning of the pandemic about how she manages it. And she's been doing this now for years. And it can just be a simple 30-second question at the beginning of a meeting. She asks questions like, what is the song that you play when you're having a bad day? Right? Or it can be things like, what is your favorite, vacation spot or bucket list, bucket list vacation thing, or your favorite car or Halloween costume. Like, it really, really doesn't need to be that extraordinary, but just that 30 seconds of checking in with each other. I've had big team meetings where we prioritized that we would all spend a little moment introducing ourselves. We actually did a big ideation session the other day. It was a 3-hour session. We spent 5 minutes connecting with each other at the beginning, and the client asked me why those 5 minutes, why we were going to spend 5 minutes doing that. I'm like, it is 5 minutes out of 180 minutes. And it literally is the critical part of making sure that we all show up for this work, and that everyone's voice is at least heard once, so that they then feel more comfortable being able to raise their voice and the rest. Like, these things are so important. We keep wanting to, like, push them out. It makes me kind of crazy. So with that, I will cut it here for a second and I introduce you to Erica Dhawan via video. John Hagel gave us a great way of being able to frame this kind of work, which is that we can zoom in sometimes and then we can zoom out. So with Erica, we really zoom in. She is considered one of the leading experts on collaboration and being able to get really big things done by working together. She has described it as connectional intelligence and has branded the whole thing around it, has a company around it. And it's not just, again, a fuzzy thing. She's got dual degrees from MIT and Harvard. She's given keynote talks and consulted with people all over the world. She's written a book about how to get big things done. But her stories actually are so intimate and so wonderful. So we'll cut to her. It's only about a 6.5 minute video. This was actually from an interview that she and I did this summer for the Futurist Society. And I felt like I could just repurpose that rather than ask her to grab time with me. Again, she's a very busy person, has 2 small little babies. In the midst of all this. So welcome to the summer version of me. We talk a lot about the capacities of the future, this sort of collection of them, and one of which is this idea of being connected, not alone, and recognizing how important it is to be both connected to yourself, but certainly connected to your peers and to broader networks around this. So this capacity that you have been cultivating for so long, I think it's amplifying and getting more and more important.
What I really saw was that there was a powerful new leadership mindset here to stay that really needed to upgrade us from the world of IQ and emotional intelligence. And I call that skill connectional intelligence, which you think about as the ability to create unrealized or new sources of value by fully harnessing the power of our networks and relationships. And I wrote my first book years ago on connectional intelligence, and really through an organic research journey, built a training company around it. And what I found was, at the heart of it, my mission is to help upgrade or evolve leadership work from conversations we had in the 80s or 90s that were really built for how do we lead in a face-to-face, office-oriented, senior leader-led organization,
and to production-focused organization, right? The productivity was really the focus then.
To how do we lead in today's virtual, global, multi-generational, matrixed work environment? And while many of the core principles are the same, we need to listen, we need to show respect, we need to care for one another, the nuances of how we lead are different. And so my first book was about upgrading us from emotional intelligence, which was the big thing in the 90s, to connectional intelligence, which I really believe is the key leadership trait in today's age, especially now in these times.
And then there's one more level to your work, which I also find really fascinating, which is this idea of being able to sense and respond inside an organization when you've built that capacity, right? You talk a lot about, and I agree, that the companies that already had been building this capacity inside their organizations were so much better prepared for this moment. Even directories that help understand who does what, so you could know how to shift resources or how to connect with people, or just understanding who was, sort of had what backgrounds, I think are really helpful. And AI is helping a lot with that and figuring out how to help organizations understand how to put teams together. But I think even the piece that you, again, have various stories that you give us as really tangible examples about being able to recognize that on the front line as a cashier at a hardware store, or in a law firm or these other places where you're able to sense that something is happening and have an ability side of that organization to bring that response up. So it's a big thought to have at the very end of this conversation. But if there's any, because I do think that is the future. I really think, there's a moment about COVID and dealing with where we are right now and how that's going to change some of the workflows. But I think in terms of also having the ability to connectionally understand outside our organization and bring it in, I think is a really key part of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. The story I often share that Nancy, you know about, is at Lowe's, they created an internal cashier to cashier network where years ago, any cashier could chat like an internal Facebook with other cashiers at other stores. And there was one cashier at one store that noticed a product that was being returned a lot. It was a pet treat for dogs. And there was buzz around it from other cashiers at other stores. And the inventory optimization team ended up taking off the product earlier because of this buzz from cashiers. Turns out there was a poisonous element in that product for dogs, and their competitors, Walmart and Target, were being sued for selling it. And so, the power of our true digital connection is to design ways for people to connect in cohorts in real time, so that we're not just setting up meetings to have conversations. We can quickly share signals with different business units, our customers, our audiences, any stakeholders, to get big things done.
I was just thinking in my head, like how far we want to go into this conversation around also just feeling like you can be who you really want to be at work and communicate the way that you want to communicate at work.
I think that this experience is having us really ask different questions about inclusion, which I'm just so happy that we are. And perhaps we needed this moment, we needed these experiences to break down, to break through. And my hope is that because we will move to more hybrid work, even post-COVID, perhaps as a result, we can be more inclusive. And I think that in many ways, giving ourselves a pause to be patient and to be conscious and careful in these times versus hasty and anxious, and frankly, what that creates is depression in these times, is the most important thing we can do. And that comes by, as you say so eloquently, being connected, not alone. And I talk about using our connectional intelligence for all of those, counting on our creativity and our wisdom and our heart.
Thank you so much for taking the time, Erica. I know you've got a lot going on.
Thank you.
Mwah. Bye. The key point that Erica makes at the end is around the fact that we're moving into an era again that is going to be highly creative, innovative, experimental. We're going to have to be in a place where we're going to be comfortable in that, right? We'll talk about diversity and inclusion and all those things again, that we have to be in a space where we can feel challenged. And the way to do that is about building those relationships and building that trust. There are a couple of people actually who are on this call right now, Josh and Rosie, who have joined with me and Emma and a couple other people to work on something that's actually really kind of profound. It's a whole way of framing a new social and economic theory / perspective / way of shaping society, in case it gets any bigger than that. And there have definitely been moments in our team where you have a conversation and it can get kind of real. And we have a part of our work in which we make sure we check in with each other at the very beginning before we start. And it's actually really helped us break through a couple of times when things got kind of intense. So I'm always grateful that I get to model it and live it with people who have taught me a lot about how important this work is. So shout out to Rosie and to Josh and to Emma. But just to continue on this conversation. So again, Erica's referenced in the book several times. She's done a lot of different research around this. One of the things I thought was fascinating is that even again at Google, they studied how to optimize what they call synchronicity, or the idea that we'd run into one another. So like in the cafeteria line, what was the right amount of time that she'd be waiting to check out? So it was like, if you just went right through, it was too fast, you didn't have a chance to connect to each other. If it was too long, you wouldn't go to the cafeteria and you wouldn't get your lunch that way. But if it was like 3 to 4 minutes, it was just enough time to potentially start up a conversation with someone that you didn't know. And she gives other examples, so they're not all in the book, but if you want to follow Erica's work, she has lots and lots of examples about how people have engineered for connection inside organizations because they understand it's an important part of moving this work forward. But now if you, again, zoom out and you go to, okay, well, what does it look like in society? What are ways in which we hold each other well in there? Because I go back to the human cloud is not just about making sure we can get our work done well or make sure that we stay sane in doing it. It's also ensuring that we've stored resources really well and we take care of the bigger whole that is us. The key person in that conversation is Douglas Rushkoff, and he has written 20 books all about how people and organizations and societies converge to create a new set of values. He wrote a book years ago called President Shock that I thought was so great. He's written how to throwing rocks at the Google bus, which is the tension he started to see between the really high-performing tech companies and the gap that was being created in the communities in which they were a part, in which people didn't feel as though they were being considered as some of the incomes rise and home prices rise and people feel left out of it. So he's been thinking about this for a long time, but he actually most recently wrote a book called Team Human, which I think is so great, and it has a quote in the beginning about survival's not an individual sport, it's a team sport. And it came actually out of an experience that he had, so to tell a story, in which he was invited to go speak to a bunch of tech moguls. Like he thought he was giving another one of his keynote talks about the frontier of technology. He's considered, Emma found me a stat that somehow he was named one of the world's most influential intellectuals by MIT. He's that kind of guy. So I know him as a buddy, but it turns out he has that kind of power. And so he's invited into this very highfalutin tech, small group, but high influential group of tech people. And instead of actually giving a keynote talk, they pulled him aside and started asking him, peppering him with questions about how they should prepare for whatever the doom that was about to happen, whether it was a financial collapse or an environmental collapse or a social upheaval. They felt like somehow things were going to get turned upside down and they were going to lose their power, and they wanted to know how to hold on to it. And he was sort of startled by the conversation, and he started talking about relational intelligence, about this idea about building connections. If you're worried, they were literally worried that their security guards would lock them into their house, or that they would somehow they would somehow be cornered by the people that they had been sort of conquering, I guess, over all this time. And he suggested, well, how about you invite your security guard's son to your child's bar mitzvah? And they were like, no, that just seemed completely crazy and absolutely not. They were literally talking about putting collars on people to be able to control them. It was really that dire. And I think he was so shaken by that experience that he realized that we've lost touch of how to stay connected to one another. That, would argue that the current business environment has become such a winner take all thing. And we certainly see this again in the growing gap between billionaires that continue to grow billions upon billions upon billions, even during a pandemic, and those that are feeling increasingly left out of that. So he wrote this book. It's got 99 points that starts with find the others and ends with find the others. And we'll just jump into this little conversation with him quickly. I know we're running late already, so it's only about 6 minutes long. And we'll hear from Douglas quickly. So the thrust of the book, as you saw, right, is this way that we have to just think very, very differently about how we approach business and how we approach society and building what it is that we want to come next. And we're in this incredible moment in time where we get to rethink and reimagine it all. So why don't we do it better than we've done it in the past? Because we certainly have created a lot of problems in the past that we don't want to replicate with what has been described as godlike technology, right?
Right.
What it is that we have coming around the corner is pretty extraordinary, and we need to think about it differently. So you and I have had some of these conversations before. I've just read a piece of the book to folks in which I talk about it. But this idea of it being a team sport, it's funny, I went back to Team Human to prep for this call, and I realized almost every page, I've got stars and annotations throughout the whole thing. It's kind of an exhausting book for me to read yours because they're always
it was pretty. It's interesting. It's pretty. It's a dense experience. If you read it right, you realize. It's 25 years of work.
As you've been sharing this work with others, what has surprised you about their either lack of understanding or what kind of surprises them about this message?
Um, gosh, I'm sometimes surprised by people's resistance to the idea that they could do better by forging solidarity with others. That how ingrained the notion is that the object of the game is to earn enough money so you can be a winner, which means separating and insulating yourself from everybody else.
So there is an idea that we all win, and that it doesn't mean that it's a zero-sum game, I guess is
Yeah.
the way I think about it.
Yeah, and that's, and that's the thing. We've just been living on it for so many years that we've forgotten that we're running our economy and our society on top of a playing board that has really particular rules invented by, you know, monarchs who have long since left the building. Yet we still operate as if that's the way things are. And it's funny because I was thinking, how I would sum up your work, or the prerequisite, I think, for doing business the way you're describing it is you got to decide up front, are you in this business, or are you only in this business to sell that business? In other words, what is your product? Is the product the good and service that you're delivering to others, which I would say is good and fun and yay? Or is your product meta? In other words, have you gone one level above your company and you just want to now sell your company?
So this distortion of quarterly growth and feeling as though I need to make sure that the stock keeps going up, and I make really short-term decisions based on that, is not considering the whole.
No,
right?
but the problem is if Luigi has to open a second branch because his debt structure has been requires expansion. In other words, if Luigi has a single profitable pizzeria, he should be allowed to keep that. He shouldn't be obligated to get another one. He should be able to say, oh, Mary, here's my pizza recipe. You go open your pizzeria over there, and let her have an independently owned different pizzeria. So now, I ran out of cheese this week. Let me call Mary and see if she's got extra cheese that'll get me through Thursday till my delivery comes. And of course she's going to do that, not because you own her, but because you actually have more strength if you don't own her and you have distributed prosperity.
All right. Yeah. So talk to me more about the distributed prosperity part, because we talk about that later on in the book, and you and I are both fans of the work that Holochain and others are doing to get there. We have this wonderful interview with Tamsin Baker Woolsey. I always get people's names messed up, but if you know her, she's she's an amazing researcher and strategist of nature, and shows us about resilience comes in very different forms than what we are used to, and how we've misinterpreted Darwin all this time.
Yeah, and I've been writing about that too. And Secret Life of Trees is great for that too, just to see great examples of Darwinian collaboration and cooperation. That what makes human beings evolved, if we are, is the extent to which we know how to cooperate. And that's what Darwin was marveling at, page after page, and that was not competition between species for dominance.
So but this goes back to, again, you're thinking about the fact that we are a team, right? And then the question is, how big is that team? Is that team my family? Is that team my company? Is my team my neighborhood? Is my team my country? It's my team the world.
Yeah. And then is your team even all human? And I call the book Team Human because that's sort of our team, but there's Team Human's ultimately part of team nature, part of team life, part of team climate, and all these other species. When you talk about find the others, Timothy Leary was the one who first said it, and he meant find the other cool psychedelic people. And I meant find the one who you think is other from you. Find, whatever it is, the Trump person, find the other, the genuine other.
That. Okay.
Yeah, beyond that, beyond your favorite other, find the other others. And then, I was talking to Tyson Tonkaporta, the indigenous scholar in Australia, and he was like, look, the others are the other animals. You gotta, the other living beings, So I'm starting to be more open to the idea that other is there's a lot of others.
Well, that's why you talked to Rianne Eisler recently on your
Yeah.
podcast, right? And she talks about partnerism. We helped build the partnerism.org site, sort of the lightweight version of all the work that's come out of her Center for Partnership Systems thinking. And this idea that it doesn't have to, again, be that it's not domination over, right? It's power with versus power over. But the fact is that the power is spread across all of that. Like she talks a lot about the idea that environment is a part of what it is that we consider within the economic what do you want to call it? That we are beholden to, right? Not just each other, but also to the whole health of the planet as we are a part of it. Douglas was like, he's so busy. He does really spend time chatting with people, but he's like, I can only do it for 15 minutes on this movement. I'm like, yes, let's do it. And we end up 45 minutes having this long conversation about all of this stuff. And I will say, just to sort of close this out, one of the things that I think is really important when we think about what it takes to build this kind of intelligence is I describe this term called pinkers. It came through some work that I did with a colleague named Lynn Casey years ago, in which we both talked about our networks. And we thought, oh my gosh, they're people you need to know. And the reason that I can feel as confident, writing a book or sitting in front of 2,000 people giving a keynote talk or doing the work that I get to do with Rosie and Josh and Emma on partnerism is because we have these vast networks of people, and they are like networks, not really necessarily ecosystems. We haven't connected the dots between all of you all, but I've really invested in building these relationships and being in communities of people who are thought leaders or provocateurs or explorers around what the key ideas are. And so I can call on them at moments like this to be part of this experience, both inside and outside the book. So I would say for sure to recognize the importance of building your own community of pinkers or network of pinkers.